I didn't plan to tell them that day. In fact, I had rehearsed dozens of versions in my head, some careful, some casual, some sarcastic, some tearful, and yet the real moment didn't follow any of those scripts. It just slipped out between bites of dinner, during a conversation that wasn't even about religion, and as soon as I said it, the air changed. But let me start earlier. I grew up in a house where religion wasn't just a belief, it was the backdrop of everything. Not a single decision, from what we ate to how we dressed to who we talked to, escaped its influence. It wasn't extreme or fanatical, just constant, like a hum in the background of life. Sunday mornings were spoken for, our prayers had schedules, our holidays had commandments, and our doubts had nowhere to go. I learned early that belief was not really about curiosity. It was about obedience. You didn't ask certain questions, not because they had no answers, but because asking them suggested something was broken in you. Still, I asked quietly at first. I wondered why so many religions claimed to be the only truth. I wondered why bad people thrived and good people suffered. I wondered why God, who supposedly wanted a relationship, communicated only through ancient texts and ambiguous feelings. I didn't feel rebellious, I felt alone. And the more I asked, the more isolated I became. Not because people were cruel, but because they were afraid that if they engaged with my doubts, they might start to have them too. So I learned to play along. I said the right words, bowed at the right times, nodded through sermons I didn't believe in, not because I was a liar, but because I was trying to protect something I hadn't yet defined. It wasn't until college that I felt something shift. There's something about being away from the environment that shaped you, that lets you actually see it for the first time. I started reading books that would have been considered dangerous back home. I listened to lectures that didn't end with, "because God said so." I met people who didn't believe in anything supernatural, and yet somehow they were kind, ethical, thoughtful. And it hit me. The sky doesn't fall when you let go of belief. It was terrifying at first, like stepping off a moving train without knowing what ground you're landing on. But over time, the fear turned into clarity. I didn't become bitter, I became honest. Still, honesty has a cost. Every time I thought about telling my family, I imagined worst-case scenarios. Not dramatic rejection, but the slow erosion of connection, the sideways glances, the change in how they spoke to me, the awkward pauses after I said something too worldly. I delayed for years, waiting for the right moment that never came. And then one night, while we were eating dinner, my brother mentioned someone he knew who had lost their faith. He said it like it was a tragedy, like the person had been swallowed by some invisible sickness. I don't know what came over me, but I just said it. I don't believe anymore either. I haven't for a while. Silence. Not angry, not dramatic, just thick with discomfort. My mom looked at her plate. My dad gave a small nod. My sister asked why, but not like she wanted an explanation, more like she was processing a loss. I didn't say much else that night, just that I still loved them, still respected them, and that I wasn't doing this to provoke or reject. I was just being honest. The days that followed were strange. There wasn't a blow-up, no intervention, no late-night calls begging me to come back, just a quiet recalibration of how we interacted. Some things became unspeakable, others became surprisingly open. My mother tried to act like nothing had changed, but I could feel her sadness beneath the surface, like she believed she had failed in some spiritual duty. My father, the more stoic one, just asked if I was happy. I said yes, and he nodded again. That seemed to be enough for him. The most unexpected response came from my grandmother. She called me one morning and said, your grandfather never believed either, but he went to church with me every Sunday because he loved me. It stayed with me, because that's really what this whole thing is about, not belief, but love. not what rituals you perform, but whether you're still willing to show up for each other. Over time, things settled. We learned how to talk around certain topics, how to gently challenge each other without starting fires, how to be a family again, not because we agreed, but because we cared enough to stay. Looking back, I'm glad I told them, not because it changed their minds, but because it freed mine. It's strange how much energy we spend pretending to believe things we don't, not for our own sake, but to keep others comfortable. And the irony is they often already know, they just don't want to say it out loud. What I've learned since then is that honesty doesn't always destroy relationships. Sometimes it strengthens them, not because it feels good in the moment, but because it builds trust over time, described herself. There's something powerful about being able to say, this is who I am, and letting the chips fall where they may. Because belief isn't just about gods or doctrines, it's about the story you tell yourself about what's true. And if that story no longer fits, eventually it starts to hurt more to stay silent than to speak. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply not lie. And if someone really loves you, they'll love the version of you that's honest. That doesn't mean it'll be easy. In some families, admitting disbelief can feel like betrayal, like you've broken some unspoken oath. But what's the point of belonging if it requires erasing parts of yourself to stay in the room? There's a quote I saw once, "The cost of pretending is your life." And I felt that, not in a dramatic way, but in the 1,000 little silences I carried before I spoke up. It's hard to be the one who breaks the spell, who stops the ritual mid-step and asks, why are we still doing this? But if no one ever does, then the spell goes on forever, long after anyone remembers why it started. That's not bravery, that's inertia. And I didn't want to live in inertia anymore, I wanted to live in truth. The most surprising part of telling the truth was realizing how much space it cleared in my life. I didn't have to fake interest in church stories anymore. I didn't have to nod along when someone thanked God for something entirely explainable. I didn't have to bite my tongue when someone claimed suffering was part of a plan. And yet, I also didn't feel the need to argue, because once you stop believing something, it doesn't mean you start crusading against it. It just means you stop letting it define you. That's a distinction I wish more people understood. Disbelief isn't hostility. It's just distance, a quiet shift in how you see the world and what kind of explanations you're willing to accept. I started having different conversations with people, not always about religion, but about meaning, ethics, purpose. And I realized that so many of the things we pretend only religion can offer are human inventions. Community, kindness, responsibility, awe. These don't come from a book, they come from being alive. And once I stopped outsourcing those values to a higher power, I began to take them more seriously. Because if there's no divine referee, then it's really up to us, not in a scary way, but in a deeply empowering way. Some people think leaving religion is like losing a compass, but that assumes the compass was ever pointing to anything real. What actually happens is you build your own compass. You stop relying on inherited rules and start asking what actually works, what actually helps people, what actually causes harm. That kind of morality isn't easier, it's harder, but it's more honest. And that's something I wish I could have said to my younger self. The one who sat quietly in pews, the one who cried at night wondering why God felt so far away, the one who thought doubt was a disease. I would tell him, you're not broken. You're just waking up. And yes, it's lonely at first because waking up in a room full of sleepers makes you feel like the strange one. But over time, you'll find others, people who didn't fit the mold, who questioned what they were taught, who left without becoming cruel, who built lives full of love and meaning without any divine blueprints. And when you meet them, you'll realize you were never alone. I've had conversations now with friends, co-workers, even strangers, who all carry their own version of this story. Some were raised in strict households, some in more casual faiths, some left gradually, others all at once. But what we all share is the moment we stopped pretending. That quiet click when something you were supposed to believe just doesn't hold anymore, when the scaffolding collapses and instead of panic, you feel relief. That relief isn't emptiness, it's freedom. Freedom to build a life based on curiosity instead of certainty, values instead of rules, growth instead of guilt. And yet, with all of that said, I don't hate where I came from. Religious life taught me discipline, tradition, language, even a kind of poetry. But it also taught me fear, shame, conformity, the idea that questioning was dangerous and authority was sacred. Letting go meant keeping the good and walking away from the rest. That's something people rarely talk about, that you can leave religion without bitterness, that you can honor your past without dragging it with you. It's not about burning bridges, it's about crossing them. I still see my family, still hug them during holidays, still laugh at inside jokes and help clean the dishes, but now there's a quiet understanding between us. That I don't need to be saved, that I'm not in rebellion, that I'm just living honestly. Some people assume that leaving religion means replacing it with something else, that we're all secretly looking for a substitute. But the truth is, you don't need to replace belief in the supernatural with anything. Sometimes what replaces it is just reality, the raw, chaotic, beautiful experience of life as it is, not as we wish it to be. And strangely, that's enough. It's enough to look up at the night sky and feel wonder without imagining someone behind it. It's enough to do the right thing because it matters now, not because of a reward later. It's enough to feel grief and joy and confusion and love without filtering it through the lens of eternity. That doesn't make it easier. In fact, it makes it more fragile. But that's what makes it matter. When everything isn't part of a divine plan, then every small act becomes sacred in its own right, not because God sees it, but because someone else does, because someone else is affected, because we only get one chance to be kind, one chance to forgive, one chance to speak up, one chance to be here. And when you realize that, when you truly accept that this is the only life we know we have, the idea of wasting it pretending starts to feel unbearable. So I stopped, and I told the truth. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I finally respected myself enough to be known. There's a silence that comes after you tell someone something real about yourself. It's not awkward, it's sacred. It's the moment when you've taken off the costume, and you're waiting to see if they still recognize you. And sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. And that's when you realize maybe you haven't lost your family, maybe you've just started becoming a real part of it, not as who they wanted you to be, but as who you are. There is something unshakable about living in alignment with your own mind. No more pretending. No more hoping that someone will guess the truth and love you anyway. Just showing up as yourself, even if that self is different from the one they prayed for. And if you're someone watching this who hasn't told your family yet, I won't tell you to do it today, only you know when it's safe, when it's right. But I will say this, you're not wrong for questioning, you're not broken for thinking, and you're not alone in feeling like you don't belong in a belief system that demands you stop being curious. Whatever path you take, it's yours. And the moment you decide to walk it honestly is the moment it starts to feel like yours too. The road ahead won't always be smooth, but it will be real, and that's more than enough. Over time, the awkwardness fades. Not all at once, and not in some feel-good Hollywood way, but gradually, like fog lifting. Conversations become less guarded, jokes return, and even if no one says it out loud, there's a sense that life is moving forward. Still, there are moments when you hear a prayer at a family gathering or someone thanks God for a miracle and you feel like a guest in your own home. Not because you don't belong, but because you've stepped into a different frame of reference. It's subtle, but it's there. The metaphors they live by are no longer yours. And that's okay. You start to realize that people don't cling to beliefs just because they think they're true. They cling because those beliefs are woven into their sense of identity, their relationships, their history. To challenge the belief is to challenge the world they've built on top of it. And when you understand that, you stop trying to argue people out of faith, not because you think it's right, but because you recognize that belief is rarely about logic. It's about fear, comfort, community, tradition. It's about filling in the gaps where life feels chaotic and painful. So instead of trying to win a debate, I just live openly. If someone asks, tell the truth. If someone's curious, I share my story. But I don't try to convert anyone. Because I know what it feels like to have someone try to change you, and how ineffective that usually is. And honestly, most people don't want answers. They want permission. Permission to admit their own doubts, to question what they've been taught, to wonder out loud without being punished, and sometimes just by existing, by being a kind, thoughtful person who doesn't believe, you give them that permission. You become living proof that a good life doesn't require belief, that morality doesn't need mythology, that meaning can be built, not assigned. There's a quiet kind of power in that, not loud, not dramatic, just real. I've had relatives come to me years later, quietly, privately, and say, I've been thinking the same things for a long time, and I always tell them the same thing. It's okay. You're allowed to think. You're allowed to doubt. You're allowed to grow beyond the story you were handed. That doesn't make you lost. It makes you honest. And honesty, once it begins, is hard to put back in the box. You start seeing things differently. The language of guilt no longer works on you. The promise of eternity stops feeling like a gift and more like a trap. And that's when you realize how deep the shift really is. It's not just that you stop believing in a God. It's that you stopped organizing your life around someone else's story. You stopped trying to earn love through obedience. You stopped accepting fear as a moral compass. You stopped outsourcing your values to invisible authorities. And in that space, something new grows. Not certainty, but clarity. Not answers, but better questions. Questions like, what does it mean to live well when no one is keeping score? What matters when you know you only get one shot? What kind of person do you want to be when you're not afraid of punishment and not working for a reward? These aren't easy questions, but they're honest ones. And when you build your life around them, you start to feel something that's not often associated with leaving faith. Peace. Not because everything's figured out, but because nothing needs to be faked. No pretending, no performing, no explaining away contradictions. Just life, unfiltered. And in that kind of life, relationships take on new meaning. They're not assignments from a divine matchmaker. They're chosen. Friendships aren't fellowship. They're mutual understanding. Love isn't a test of faith, it's just love. And family, well, family becomes something you renegotiate. You find new ways to stay close, even when you no longer see the world the same way. And if you're lucky, really lucky, your family begins to see you not as a threat, but as a person. Not someone who walked away from truth, but someone who walked toward it in their own way. That's what happened with mine. Eventually, it took time, but once the dust settled, they could see I wasn't lost. I wasn't angry or empty or flailing. I was just me. And in some ways, I was more present than I'd ever been. More grounded, more grateful, more engaged with the world around me. Because when you stop living for the next life, this one starts to matter so much more. You notice things. the way light hits the window in the morning, the way people open up when they feel safe, the way laughter fills a room and then disappears like smoke. You start to understand that this brief, strange, beautiful moment we get is enough. It doesn't need to be part of a plan. It doesn't need cosmic validation. It just needs your attention and the freedom to be lived honestly. That's what telling my family did for me. It marked the start of a different kind of life. Not louder, not easier, but clearer. A life where I didn't have to check my thoughts against Scripture, where I didn't have to defend invisible beliefs, where I didn't have to hide. I won't pretend it was painless, but I will say this, it was worth it. Because the moment I told the truth, I began to belong to myself, and that, more than anything, has made all the difference.